As I mentioned this morning, we're continuing tonight, or going to continue tonight, looking at a lesson that we begin this morning that was entitled New Beginnings. And of course, it's based upon Genesis chapter 8. If you have your Bibles with you, you can be turning over there with me. You might have noticed, if you were looking along this morning, that we didn't have very many verses left in Genesis chapter 8, but I don't want Dennis to get too excited tonight, so I'm not going to say the lesson's going to be short. But I think there is a lot of information that's packed there into Genesis chapter 8. If you recall this morning, we basically looked at three different points from that chapter: how God remembered his own, how God renewed the earth, and then how God rewarded the faith or the faithful. Tonight we're going to look at two more points that are found here within this chapter. And the first one comes from verse 30, or verse 20. Now I want to mention, as we're looking over there, that Genesis chapter 8 it's an interesting chapter to me, because it's a chapter that when you read about it, it can give you hope and encouragement. The major theme of that chapter, as you probably noticed, is the idea of renewal and rest after tribulation. We might describe it as life after the storm, because that's literally what it was for Noah and his family. And so this chapter records the end of the storm and the beginning of new life. And that new life here upon this earth gave new hope to God's creation, not only to humankind, but also to the earth itself, as God had restructured it for all the life to live upon it. Tonight we're going to begin again in verse 20, and we're going to talk about how you look at verse 20 and you can see that God is receiving the worship that Noah offers to him. It says there, beginning in verse 20, that Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Well, we read about how Noah and his family had been upon that ark for about the space of a year now, and God finally gives them the okay to enter or to step out of that ark. What would be the first thing that you would do whenever you stepped out of the ark? Well, Noah was so appreciative to God for what he had done for him that he immediately leads his family in worship. He's offering burnt offerings and sacrifices unto God. He walks with the Lord. We talked about this morning how you read about Noah and all these things that he did that made him pleasing to God. How he walked with God, how he worked for the Lord whenever he built the ark, how he witnessed to other people about the impending doom that was coming upon them, how he waited for the instructions of God before he stepped off the ark. And then we read about here how he worships the Lord. And I can imagine, as we think about the worship of Noah, my mind and my thoughts go back to the worship of Abel. How Abel did exactly what God told him to do in worship, and God accepted that offering that Abel brought. My thoughts go back to one of the previous men that we read about, the man that was the descendant of Adam, Seth, and how Seth and his descendants began calling upon the name of the Lord. Well, that's what Noah was doing. He was invoking the help or the aid of the Lord by offering these burnt offerings unto God. And so here's what we notice from looking at this worship. We notice that Noah gave all to God. And one of the things that the Bible teaches us that is important to understand about this particular story and many others is that Noah offered a burnt offering unto God. And notice what animals he did it of. He didn't just do it of one or two clean animals. The Bible said of every clean animal and every clean bird that Noah had upon that ark, he offered them as a burnt offering unto God. Well, if you're familiar with the concept of the burnt offering, I often say there's a reason why they call it that. It's because they all got burned up. There were certain offerings in the Old Testament and even in the patriarchal age that people would offer to God, and then they would benefit from that offering. They might receive a portion or a part of that offering, or they might eat part of it, which symbolized peace and fellowship between them and God or between other people. But the burnt offering, you literally got nothing back from it. You took the entire animal and you burned it upon the altar. In Leviticus chapter 1, you can read about all the specifics that are involved in that burnt offering. But I do just want to mention verse 9 there, because when I say everything, that's what I mean, everything. Literally, we read there, but his inwards and his legs shall he wash in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of sweet savor unto the Lord. Even the intestines, even the insides, the entrails of the animal, the organs of the animals, they were washed, but they were also offered in that burnt offering. It included the idea of the entire animal being burnt to God. So when Noah offered these burnt offerings, we're reading about how he's giving all of them to God. The idea or the principle that's often emphasized in a burnt offering is nothing is held back, or as we read there in Leviticus 1:9, all is on the altar. And that was the biblical law. Now remember this, Noah, we often say Noah took two animals upon the ark, two of every animal upon the ark. And of course that's true, he did of every kind, but also of the clean animals, he took 7 of those. Now people might look at that and they might say, well, if I had 7 animals, I'd probably offer one of them to the Lord too. Can you imagine the faith that it took for Noah to do that? These animals, the entire world is depending on these animals. Noah and his family are depending on these animals to repopulate and to refill the earth. To take one of each of those valuable animals and to offer them entirely unto God, again, reflects the great faith that Noah had, that God was going to take care of everything, and in the end, he didn't have to worry about it. But it still must have been hard knowing that the fate of the animal world rested upon all those animals that were still alive. Well, what did the offering symbolize? It symbolized total dedication to God. It symbolized the life of Noah, giving it all to God. And notice the reaction of God. When Noah offers all that he has in this burnt offering, God smells a pleasing aroma. In fact, in the verse 21 there, the first part of the verse, the King James Version says, the Lord smelled a sweet savor. I've mentioned this before, and I often do, and I don't know, it just, to my mind, is something that stands out. But I don't know if you've ever smelled burning flesh before. If you've ever taken a dead animal and you've tried to get rid of that animal, and you might have thrown it on a brush pile or something like that, I wouldn't describe the smell as a pleasant aroma. Have you ever smelled singed hair? Well, again, when I think of the smell of burning flesh and singed hair, it's not an idea that I would describe as a pleasant aroma. Of course, the Bible, as it indicates to us, it's not necessarily the smell per se that God was appreciative of and that made it appealing to him. It's just simply telling us something. It's a human way of stating a divine truth. It helps us better understand what's going on here. And so it's not necessarily the smell per se that was pleasing to God, but it was the idea of what Noah was doing. The fact that he was taking these animals, he was wholly dedicating them to God. He was burning them all upon the altar because he was so appreciative. He was so grateful that God had been with them through this flood, that he'd seen them through faithfully, and now they were getting ready to step into this new life and this new place that God had prepared for them. It's just a simple way of saying that God was satisfied with the offering that Noah offered to him. God accepted it. God was pleased with Noah's worship. The Bible teaches us, of course, there were times when people offered offerings to God, when he did not smell a sweet aroma. In fact, God warned his people of that very thing in the book of Leviticus, among many others. But in the book of Leviticus, in Leviticus chapter 26, you'll find a chapter that basically lays down the idea to the children of Israel: if you keep my laws and you keep my commandments, you walk in them, you keep them, you perform my word, then these are the blessings that I'm going to pour out upon you. But then God also says, he says, if you choose not to obey, and if you choose to not to observe these commandments that I've given to you, here's some things that are going to happen. If you go down in that chapter up to about verse 31, here's what God said. He said, I will make your cities waste and bring your sanctuaries unto desolation, and I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors. And again, this is idea of God smelling something when the people were presenting offerings unto him.
Well, what does it mean if God refused to smell the fragrance of man's offering to him? It meant that God was displeased with the worship. And so what we're learning about here, when God smells this sweet aroma that Noah offered, when he offers this offering up to him, God is pleased with Noah. He's pleased with his faith. He's pleased with his obedience to him. He's pleased with the idea that he's worshiping him and giving him his all. You know, the New Testament continues this idea of God smelling this sweet or this pleasant aroma. We might say a pleasant perfume. I think that's some way some versions translated it. But God accepting this offering. In the New Testament, it's continuing this idea from a concept that's found in the Old Testament when it talks about Christ. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 2, Paul would write, encouraging the church at Ephesus to walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us and hath given himself to us for an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. You know, ultimately, these animal sacrifices were, and the idea of God smelling this pleasant aroma was pointing to Jesus and the sacrifice that he would make. And of course, when Jesus made that sacrifice, the Bible describes to us the idea of God smelling this pleasant aroma. Well, again, it wasn't a smell per se, but it's simply telling us that God accepted this sacrifice, that he was pleased with what was being offered up to him. As Christians, we are commanded under New Testament law to offer offerings unto God. Of course, we don't offer animal sacrifices like they did in the Old Testament, but rather they're spiritual sacrifices that we offer up to God. Paul would encourage the church at Rome in Romans 12 and beginning in verse 1. He said, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And what I want us to think about is this idea of what God smelled whenever Noah offered a sacrifice to him. Again, we don't offer the animal sacrifices, but we do offer up spiritual sacrifices to God. And so I'd encourage us to think about this idea. What does our worship smell like to God? Does God smell a pleasing aroma whenever we're offering up our worship to him? What do our spiritual sacrifices smell like to God? Are we living morally every day as God has commanded us to live here upon this earth? What does God smell whenever we offer our worship or our sacrifices up to him? Well, part of the reason that God smelled a pleasant aroma is because Noah was giving all of it to God. And the Bible teaches us that if we don't give our all to God, then of course God is not going to be accepted with or pleased with our worship or with any sacrifice that we might make to him. And so we read about God receiving the worship of Noah. The fifth thing that we read about in this chapter is God reaffirming the natural order. Notice what he says in verse 21, about the middle of the verse. The Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. It's interesting to me when you begin reading there in the middle of verse 21, these aren't words that God spoke out loud to Noah. In fact, the Bible tells us right there in that verse that these words were spoken, God spoke to himself. God said this to his own heart. And what he said was a gracious response to Noah's faith and obedience and his worship that he had offered up to him. Basically, I think there are three things that God lays down to kind of set the earth back in order again. The first thing that we read about is there are not going to be any more curses upon the ground. Remember back in the beginning in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve, we read about how God cursed the ground because of man's sin. In verse 17 of Genesis chapter 3, God says to Adam, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. And so, from the Garden of Eden, we studied that, and in that study, if you remember, we mentioned this idea how after man was exiled from the garden, that the earth was not going to be like it was before. It wasn't going to grow like it did before. It wasn't going to be easy for man to produce crops and to have something to eat. He's going to have to work on it. It was going to take sweat in order to produce food from the ground. And so God had cursed the earth because of man's sin. We also know in Genesis chapter 4 that God further cursed the earth, at least in as far as it pertained to Cain. Because Cain killed his brother Abel, beginning in verse 11 there of Genesis 4, God said, "Now thou art cursed from the earth, which had opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest it, it shall not yield unto thee her strength." Now, two curses that God has put on the ground from the beginning of mankind because of sin. And here's what God decided after the flood. He said, "I'm not going to curse the ground anymore." Now, I want to emphasize to you, it's not the case that God was promising to undo the previous curses that had been put on the ground. This was the promise that he made. He said, "I'm just not going to curse it anymore. I'm not going to make it any more difficult for mankind than it already is." Did it erase the curse of the earth back in Genesis 3? No, not in any way. But God just made this statement. He said, "I'm not going to do it anymore." And so we have this great promise of God where He's putting things within this natural order, and they're just not going to change anymore. The second thing that I'll invite you to look at is God said there's not going to be any more cosmic cataclysms. Now that's a tongue twister there, but it just basically means no more universal destruction. God, as you look in verse 21, He gave a reason there as to why this was going to be. He says, "For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth." And then He says, "Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done." The way that we translate "for," it's giving us the reason why God made this decision, that is, not to curse the ground and not to cause any more universal destruction of the earth as He had when pertaining like things to the flood. But it basically, how do you translate that word, or how do you take it? Well, there's two ways that you can take it. Some people think it means this idea, God destroyed all of mankind, and while He destroyed the transgressors, did it really destroy the heart and the nature of man? I mean, aren't we still the same today as we were back there in the days of Noah? It really didn't change the ultimate problem that man had, and that was a problem of the heart. Now, it did take care of cleansing the earth, but it really didn't change man as you look at the way that we've progressed even today. The second way is to look at it like this, and that is God understands this principle. Yeah, man's done things that are worthy of universal judgment. They deserve judgment because of their evil and their wicked ways. But in grace, I'm not going to spend a universal destruction upon mankind anymore. And so, the way that we translate that is kind of important, I guess, as to how we see exactly what God is saying. But if you really think about it, both of them are true, aren't they? I mean, the fact that man's heart is still evil and corrupt today, just like it was in the days of the flood. And the fact that, yes, we do deserve the judgment of God, but in God's mercy and grace, He's chosen not to destroy us on a universal level as He did in the days of Noah. There's a couple of interesting thoughts that often come from this statement. Some people believe, because of what God said, that God is not going to judge anybody for sin today, or that there will be no future judgment of this world. Well, that's not what God was saying. The Bible tells us that there was a certain judgment that God did have in mind, and a certain instance that He did have in mind. But let me point out that God still judges sin today. God has judged sin from the time of the flood. There's going to be an ultimate day when He judges sin. The difference is He doesn't judge it on a universal level. God's judgment is never poured out upon mankind where the entire earth receives the wrath of God. The New Testament tells us in Romans chapter 1 and verse 8, Paul just made this statement, and he made it about the Gentile world, but he said, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness." It's this idea that the wrath of God is being poured out from heaven upon mankind. Well, you look back through through the Bible, from the time of the flood to the time in which we live today, do you ever see God judging individuals? Well, yeah, you do, don't you? Do you ever see God judging nations? Yes, you do. Do you ever see God judging the universal earth? No, you don't. God said, I'm not going to have any kind of judgment like that again. God does judge individuals. He does judge nations. That form of judgment, the wrath of God takes many different forms. You can't just point to one thing and say, well, this is how God judges individuals and this is how God judges nations. He uses all kinds of things to bring them into judgment. But there are numerous forms of judgment that have been poured out upon individuals and nations throughout the Scripture. And of course, I believe that God is still pouring His wrath and His judgment out upon nations and individuals today. But there's not going to be a universal judgment in the sense that the whole world is going to be reformed again and man's going to get another chance. God said it's not going to happen like this again. It's also interesting to point out in Romans chapter 1, Paul again talking about how the wrath of God was being poured out from heaven upon the Gentiles. He mentions one of those forms of judgment in verse 28. And notice what he says there. He says, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. The idea of God giving up on them, or God giving over to their, giving in to them, and letting them do whatever they wanted to do. Do you realize that's one of the forms of the wrath of God? It's one of the forms of the judgment of God. There's a point where God just allows individuals and nations and says, listen, I've tried to persuade you to do something different, but if this is the course that you want to pursue, I'm going to let you pursue that course. And now you're going to have to live with the consequences of the choices that you're making. And so that's one of the forms of the judgment of God. I think about, we've been studying on Wednesday nights, the idea of a king being appointed within Israel. You know, God told the nation of Israel, don't appoint a king over you. They said, no, we want a king. And so we want to pursue that path. And God says, okay, if that's the path you want to pursue, take off. And remember who they got? They got Saul, right? God said, you're going to have to live with the consequences of the choices that you've made now. And God does that time and time again. In fact, I would be convinced that looking at our world today, that that's some of the judgment that we're experiencing from God. When mankind says, we want to go this way, we want to pursue this path, God says, take off and go, and now you're going to have to live with the consequences of the choices that you've made. But it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a final judgment, and that's really what I want to emphasize. It's just that there's not going to be a universal judgment where man is going to get another chance like he got whenever the flood came upon him. And so, no more cosmic cataclysms. The third thing that I'll emphasize to you in reaffirming the natural order is God said there's not going to be any interruptions in the cycles of nature. In verse 22, he said, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest and cold and heat and summer and winter and day and night shall not cease. Understand this, the flood interrupted the cycles of this earth, including the seasons, for an entire year. For an entire year, I think God suspended all the cycles of the earth in order to bring about this flood and to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. Then he makes this promise. He says, I'm not going to do this anymore. Now there's going to be a rhythm within the earth. There's going to be a rhythm of days and weeks and seasons. And this is going to continue as long as this earth endures. Well, why would that be such a great promise? Because what that tells us is that as long as we have these cycles, we can be sure that we're going to have the necessities of life. As long as these cycles continue, we can be sure that life can exist here upon this earth. You know, so many people today are concerned with the idea, well, we're going to destroy the earth. We're going to destroy mankind. We're going to make it where you can't even live on it. God said it's not going to happen. As long as I'm in control, there's always going to be a rhythm. There's always going to be the opportunity for you to produce the necessities of life. The Bible tells us in Psalm 24 and verse 1 that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and the world and they that dwell therein. God made this universe, and he made it in a way so that it would operate effectively. God pointed out to us, and he arranged the things here upon this earth in such a way that living things can survive. That includes plants, that includes animals, and that certainly includes mankind. And so it's a guarantee from God. What does that guarantee do? It gives us hope for the future. As we face the unknown in the future, one of the things that we don't have to worry about is whether the cycles of this earth are going to end. They're always going to be in a way where it can produce life upon this earth. You know, that's a great promise in a difficult time. We might have to worry, or I guess we don't have to worry, but we do worry about a lot of different things in life. But one thing we don't have to worry about is day and night, summer and winter, heat and cold. That's always going to exist as long as this earth is in existence. Now, I know sometimes we think about these weather patterns and that the seasons and the days and the nights and the things produce, and we complain a lot about them, don't we? I was thinking about Jonah. You know how the Bible talks about Jonah in Jonah chapter 4 and verses 5 and 6. Remember, he goes out and he's so hot he makes himself a booth. He provides himself some shade, and God even produces a plant, and it provides Jonah some shade. But I thought about that. I thought, we're a lot like Jonah a lot of times, aren't we? We have all these modern blessings and all these modern advances in our time that we can almost negate some things, like day and night. What does the invention of electricity do for us? Well, you don't have to go to bed when the sun goes down, do you? And you don't have to get up at sunrise. You can even work at dark because you have this invention of electricity. What about if you don't like the weather where you're living? Well, you can travel to a different part of the country and you can experience a different climate. And we like to complain about those things. It's either too dry or it's too wet, it's too hot or it's too cold. But we should be appreciative of all those different cycles, because what the Bible teaches us is that God established them so that life can continue to exist here upon this earth. If God were to take away the idea of day and night, if He were to dim the sun, or if He were to rearrange the seasons, or if He was to tilt the earth just a little bit in one direction or the other, our world would be in imminent danger. Thanks to the grace of God, we don't have to worry about those things. God says as long as this earth exists, these natural cycles are going to continue, and so we never have to worry about them being altered as they were in the days of Noah. I don't know about you, but I often take things for granted in this world, the very things that we read about in our study tonight. Things like the sunrise and the sunset, the different phases of the moon, the changing seasons, but all these functions are evidence that God is on His throne and He is keeping these promises that He made to mankind and Noah long ago. All creation preaches this constant sermon day after day after day, season after season, that God cares for us, that He loves us, and His grace and His mercy is being poured out upon us every minute of every day that we live here upon this earth. Maybe there's one present here tonight